Derek Lawson thought his bank was running smoothly until he went undercover and found a terrified employee trapped under a manager's control. Derek had spent his entire life working his way up in the banking industry. He wasn't born into wealth. He didn't have connections that smoothed his path. Everything he had, he built from the ground up. Starting as a part-time teller in college, he balanced long hours, impatient customers, and coursework, knowing exactly what it felt like to clock in and out while worrying about making ends meet. Even after becoming the CEO of Ashford National Bank, he refused to sit in a corner office and make decisions based solely on reports and numbers. A spreadsheet didn't tell you what was really happening in the branches. The real stories lived in the break rooms, in quiet conversations between employees, in exhausted sighs at the end of a long shift. That's why every few months, Derek went undercover. No suit, no title, no corporate entourage, just a man walking into his own banks as a regular customer. Most of the time, he found small issues, long wait times, an employee struggling with the software, a customer service rep who looked like they needed a break. But every now and then, he saw something that shook him. Tonight, he chose a small branch in Columbus, Ohio. According to reports, it wasn't struggling, profits were steady, customer satisfaction scores were solid. On paper, it was just another ordinary location. But numbers didn't show you everything. Derek walked in wearing a navy blue button-down, sleeves rolled up, paired with jeans. He looked like any other customer stopping by after work. The bank had that early evening quiet, just a handful of customers finishing transactions before heading home. The fluorescent lighting was a little too bright, the air conditioning a little too cold. Behind the counter, tellers handled deposits and withdrawals with the efficiency of people who had done it 1,000 times before. A middle-aged man in front of him fumbled with his debit card, trying to explain something to the teller. The young woman behind the counter smiled politely, but there was tension in her eyes. Derek glanced around. Near the back of the bank, a manager in a stiff gray suit hovered, watching interactions closely. Something about his posture was off, not just observant but controlling. Derek didn't have time to analyze further because that's when he heard it, a soft, muffled sound coming from the hallway to the left. At first, it barely registered, but when the customer in front of him finally moved along, the sound became clearer. Someone was crying, not loud, not dramatic, a quiet, stifled sob, the kind you let out when you're trying not to break. Derek turned slightly, following the sound with his eyes. The break room door was slightly ajar, revealing a young woman inside. Her head was bowed, fingers gripping the edge of the table like she was trying to keep herself together. Another employee stood beside her, speaking in hushed tones. Derek didn't know her, but the look on her face hit him like a punch to the gut. Something was very wrong. But the question was, what? Derek stood in line, his body facing the counter, but his mind was elsewhere. That crying, it wasn't just frustration, it was pain. He knew the difference. He had seen employees overwhelmed by busy days or irritated by difficult customers, but this was something deeper. His instincts told him to walk over, to ask if she was okay, but he wasn't Derek Lawson's CEO in this moment. He was just another customer, a stranger. So instead, he listened. The other employee, a young man, maybe mid-20s, kept his voice low, trying to console her. Derek caught fragments of their conversation. "Jasmine, you can't let him. He doesn't own you." "Jasmine," that was her name. Her response was nearly a whisper, but Derek picked up the defeat in her tone. "What choice do I have?" she murmured. "He's already made it clear. If I don't do what he says, I'm gone." Derek's jaw tightened. His first thought, a customer issue? Banks saw their fair share of entitled customers who thought they could talk down to tellers, but the way she said it, "if I don't do what he says," that wasn't about a customer. That was about someone inside the bank. Before he could think further, the teller in front of him called out, "Sir, I can help you over here." Derek turned and walked up, offering a polite smile. The young man behind the counter, Kenny, according to his name tag, looked fresh out of college. "How's your day going?" Derek asked, keeping his voice light. Kenny hesitated for just a second. It was barely noticeable, but Derek caught it. "Hey, it's been good," Kenny said, forcing a smile. "How can I help you today?" Derek pulled a deposit slip from his pocket, something he always carried during these undercover visits. "Just need to make a deposit." Kenny took the slip and entered the account number into the system, but Derek could see it, the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing. He was distracted, on edge. Derek glanced at the manager near the back of the bank, the one with the stiff posture and constant surveillance. His gaze flickered toward the break room for just a second. Kenny must have noticed Derek looking because he suddenly spoke up, lowering his voice. "Do you work in banking?" Derek raised an eyebrow. "What makes you ask?" Kenny hesitated, then shrugged. "You just seem like you've been in a branch before." Derek smiled. "Yeah, I used to be a teller, a long time ago." Something in Kenny's face shifted, a mix of relief and hesitation, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. Derek gave him a moment, but Kenny glanced over his shoulder again, toward the manager. And just like that, the opportunity was gone. Kenny slid the receipt across the counter. "Here you go, sir. Anything else I can help with?" Derek took the receipt, but he wasn't done here. "No, I'm good," he said, pocketing it. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "But take care of yourself, Kenny." Just for a second. But Derek saw it. He stepped away from the counter, heading toward the exit, but he had no intention of leaving. Instead, he stopped near the loan officer's desk and pretended to check his phone. From here, he had a perfect view of the break room. Jasmine had wiped her face and was sitting up straight now, but her hands still trembled in her lap. The young man beside her was speaking urgently, shaking his head, but she wasn't meeting his eyes. And then Derek saw it. The manager, Mr. Stiff Posture, walking toward them. His steps were slow, calculated, like a predator approaching prey. And as soon as Jasmine saw him, her entire body tensed. Derek knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't good. And he wasn't walking away until he found out the truth. Derek didn't leave the bank. Instead, he moved toward the seating area near the entrance, pretending to scroll through his phone while keeping his ears open. He wasn't sure what was happening yet, but something was off. The way Jasmine had reacted to the manager, the way Kenny hesitated before answering him, it all pointed to a bigger problem. The manager reached the break room, standing in the doorway like he owned the space. His presence was enough to make Jasmine shrink into herself, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The young man beside her, probably another teller, stood protectively, though he was visibly nervous. Derek couldn't hear everything, but he caught bits and pieces. "I don't want to hear any more complaints," the manager, whose name tag read Richard Calloway, said in a low, clipped tone. "You know how things work here. You do your job, you keep quiet, and you don't make waves. Do we understand each other?" Jasmine's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." Richard leaned in slightly, louder. She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Derek's grip on his phone tightened. This wasn't just bad management, this was intimidation, and judging by the way Jasmine responded, it wasn't the first time. Richard glanced at the young man beside her. "And you?" The young teller, his name tag read Miguel, looked like he wanted to say something, but in the end he nodded. "Yes, sir." Richard straightened, glancing around the bank to ensure no one had been watching. But he missed Derek, still seated in the lobby, phone in hand. He turned back to Jasmine. "Good, now get back to work." Jasmine and Miguel exchanged a brief look before slowly making their way out of the break room. Derek could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from weeks, maybe months of enduring something she felt powerless to change. Derek knew he had to step in, but he couldn't blow his cover just yet. He needed more information. Derek spent the next 30 minutes watching the bank's operations, noting small details. Every time Jasmine interacted with a customer, she forced a smile, but the light in her eyes was gone. Miguel, too, looked like he was constantly on edge, glancing toward Richard every few minutes. Richard, on the other hand, walked around like he owned the place. He didn't help customers, didn't assist his employees. He just watched, looming over the tellers like a shadow, making sure they knew he was always there. Finally, Derek made his move. He walked up to Jasmine's window just as her previous customer left. She forced another polite smile. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" Derek leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Are you okay?" Jasmine blinked, her smile faltering. "Excuse me?" "I saw what happened earlier," he said gently. "If something's wrong, there are people who can help." Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted some paperwork. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. Do you have a transaction?" Derek sighed internally. She was scared. Too scared to say anything. He needed a different approach. "Just a balance inquiry," he said, sliding his card across the counter. Jasmine nodded, swiping the card and pulling up his account. As she typed, Derek noticed Richard watching them from across the room. His eyes were sharp, his posture rigid. "I appreciate the service here," Derek continued, keeping his voice light. "Must be a great place to work." Jasmine hesitated before responding, It's fine. Derek caught the slight flicker of emotion in her eyes before she buried it. She printed his balance statement and handed it back. Here you go, sir. Is there anything else? Derek glanced toward Richard. The manager was still watching. No, Derek said, taking the slip. But thank you, Jasmine. I hope your night gets better. Her lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face. She quickly schooled her features and nodded. Thank you, sir. Have a good night. Derek stepped away, tucking the slip into his pocket. He wasn't done here. Not by a long shot. Back in his rental car, Derek pulled out his phone and made a call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Cynthia Palmer speaking. Derek smiled. Cynthia, it's Derek. I need a favor. Derek, didn't expect to hear from you. What's going on? Cynthia had been a regional director for Ashford National Bank for over a decade. She was sharp, no nonsense, and most importantly, she cared about the people who worked under her. I need you to pull some reports on a branch manager named Richard Calloway, Derek said. Columbus, Ohio, branch on Westfield Road, employee complaints, turnover rates, customer satisfaction surveys, anything unusual? Cynthia didn't hesitate. Give me a couple of hours. Appreciate it. And Cynthia, keep this quiet for now. Understood. Derek ended the call and exhaled slowly. He had a feeling the numbers would tell him exactly what he already suspected. Richard Calloway was a problem, and Derek Lawson was going to fix it. The next morning, Derek checked his phone as soon as he woke up. As expected, there was a message from Cynthia waiting for him. Cynthia, just sent you the reports. You were right. High turnover, excessive complaints, and some customer dissatisfaction. Calloway has been at this branch for 3 years, and in that time, he's had over 20 employees quit. Most cited a hostile work environment. I also found a few HR complaints, but nothing was done. Let me know how you want to proceed. Derek exhaled, shaking his head. He had suspected Richard Calloway was a problem, but this was worse than he had imagined. He responded quickly. Derek, thanks. Cynthia, I'll be in touch soon. He opened the reports, skimming through them. The pattern was clear. Richard ran his branch through intimidation, and employees either complied or left. Jasmine wasn't just another case. She was another victim in a long history of abuse. Derek had seen enough. Later that day, Derek returned to the branch. This time, he wasn't undercover. He walked in wearing a crisp navy suit, his CEO badge clipped to his lapel. Employees glanced up as he entered, whispers passing between them. Derek headed straight to the teller line where Jasmine was stationed. Her eyes widened when she recognized him, panic flickering in her expression. Good afternoon, Jasmine, he said warmly. Can I speak with you for a moment? Jasmine hesitated, darting a quick glance toward Richard's office. Derek followed her gaze, and sure enough, Richard was standing in his doorway, arms crossed, watching the interaction. Actually, Derek continued, his voice firm but calm, I'd like to speak with the whole team. Let's have a quick meeting. Richard's expression darkened, but he couldn't refuse. This was his boss standing in front of him. Within minutes, the employees gathered in the break room. Derek stood at the front, Jasmine and Miguel near the back, arms crossed protectively. First off, Derek began, I want to thank each of you for your hard work. I know banking isn't always easy, and I appreciate what you do, but I also know that work environments matter. You should feel safe, respected, and valued. If that's not the case, I want to hear about it. The room was silent, employees shifting uncomfortably. Derek's eyes swept over them, landing on Jasmine. She was staring at the floor, hesitant. Richard spoke up. Mr. Lawson, I assure you, our employees are treated well. I run a tight ship. But fairness is always a priority. Derek turned to him. I read the HR reports, Richard. Over 20 employees have left under your management. That's not just a coincidence. Richard's jaw tightened. People leave jobs all the time. Derek nodded. They do, but not because they're being mistreated. And I've been told about your approach to discipline, public humiliation. That stops today. Jasmine looked up then, her lips parting in surprise. Other employees exchanged glances. Derek turned back to the team. If any of you have experienced harassment or unfair treatment, you have my full support to speak up. Nothing will happen to you for telling the truth. A long beat of silence passed. Then Jasmine took a shaky breath. I have something to say. Richard stiffened, his fists clenching at his sides, but Derek kept his gaze steady on Jasmine. Go ahead, Derek encouraged. Jasmine swallowed hard. Richard has made this job unbearable. He threatens us constantly, makes us work unpaid overtime, and if we complain, he reminds us how easily replaceable we are. He's made me feel like I have no choice but to stay quiet. She glanced at Miguel, who nodded in agreement. Derek turned back to Richard. Anything to say to that? Richard's face was flushed. This is ridiculous. These employees are just upset about being held to high standards. Derek shook his head. No, Richard. Holding employees accountable is one thing. Abusing your authority is another. And as of today, you are no longer employed at Ashford National Bank. Security will escort you out. The tension in the room broke instantly. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Derek had already made his decision. 2 security officers stepped forward, waiting. Richard's face twisted with anger, but he knew he had no ground to stand on. Without another word, he stormed out, security following close behind. Jasmine exhaled sharply. Her hands trembling slightly, Miguel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Derek turned back to the group. If any of you need to talk, my door is open. I promise you, things will change. A few employees nodded, relief settling over them. Jasmine gave him a grateful look, and for the first time since he'd walked into that branch, she looked like she could finally breathe again. Richard Calloway was gone, escorted out of the bank like the tyrant he had been. As soon as the doors closed behind him, a heavy silence filled the room, followed by a collective exhale from the employees. It was as if an invisible weight had finally been lifted off their shoulders. Jasmine, still gripping the edge of the table, looked up at Derek. Did that really just happen? Derek gave her a small, reassuring smile. Yes, Jasmine, it did, and it was long overdue. Miguel let out a nervous chuckle, running a hand through his hair. I never thought I'd see the day. He always acted like he was untouchable. People like him rely on fear to maintain control, Derek said. But once that fear is gone, they have nothing left. And he had no business leading a team, not like this. A murmur of agreement passed through the room. Employees exchanged glances, some looking relieved, others still processing what had just happened. Derek knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. Stephen Kessler, the regional director who had quietly slipped into the branch just as Richard was being removed, stepped forward. First, I want to personally apologize to all of you. Richard's behavior should never have been tolerated for as long as it was. We failed you, and that's something we're going to fix. Derek nodded. From today forward, things will be different. We're implementing a full review of employee policies, starting with a confidential reporting system. No one should feel unsafe coming to work. Jasmine shifted on her feet. Will there be a new manager? Derek smiled. Yes, but we're not rushing to replace Richard with just anyone. We'll take the time to find someone who will lead with respect. In the meantime, Stephen and I will oversee operations to ensure a smooth transition. There was a pause before a soft round of applause started. It wasn't just for Richard's removal. It was for the promise of something better. Lisa, one of the senior tellers, stepped forward. Mr. Lawson, I just want to say thank you. I've worked here for 5 years and I thought about quitting more times than I can count. But knowing that leadership actually cares, that makes a difference. Derek met her gaze, sincerity in his expression. You all matter, and you all deserve to work in a place where you feel valued. Jasmine, still a bit hesitant, finally managed a smile. Maybe this place won't be so bad after all, Derek chuckled. Give us a little time, and I think you'll see real change. Over the next few weeks, things did change. The branch felt different. Employees walked in without the usual tension in their shoulders. Conversations that had once been whispered in fear now carried an air of normalcy. Customers noticed too. Transactions felt lighter. Tellers smiled more genuinely. The toxic energy Richard had spread for years was finally gone. One afternoon, Derek returned to check in. He didn't come as CEO this time, just as a customer. Jasmine was at her station, greeting people with ease. When she spotted him, she grinned. Back again, she teased. Derek smirked. Just making sure you're still here. She nodded. Still here. And for the first time in a long time, I actually like my job. So, thanks for that. You don't have to thank me, Derek said. Just keep proving why this place is worth saving. Jasmine chuckled. Deal. As Derek stepped outside, he took one last glance at the branch, feeling a sense of accomplishment. One bad manager might have made this place unbearable, but good people still remained, and now they had a chance to rebuild something better. It had started as a simple undercover visit, but in the end, it had turned into something much bigger, something that mattered. And for Derek Lawson, that was the best kind of success.